January 6th. The very mention of that date is associated with powerful emotions in the minds of many Americans. The capital of our country, the most powerful nation in the world, overrun. Senators and the vice president driven into hiding, as representatives sought cover on the floor of their chamber. By the end of the day, over 100 police officers and an unknown number of protesters or rioters were injured. There were even 4 dead Trump supporters. This did not have to happen. We all know this. But if you start to think about it, that this didn't have to happen, that idea leads you to some very unsettling questions. What went wrong with the security of the Capitol? What could have been done to avoid this? How could unarmed rioters overrun the Capitol? Very unsettling, but very important questions. For me, this story isn't just an intellectual exercise. I'm an independent journalist. I've filmed dozens of political protests, worked on a documentary series, and traveled overseas on projects. And I was there on January 6th filming. I witnessed some of these events. Like many of you, my initial perspective matched the mainstream narrative, that the police had no chance, that they were simply overwhelmed by the massive numbers of angry Trump supporters storming the Capitol. But then I shared a clip on Twitter that went viral. One important scene I witnessed was a man being carried off on an improvised stretcher. I heard he had broken both his legs and he appeared to be unconscious. When I posted a video on Twitter of this incident, I was surprised. Many people were not aware that this incident had occurred, and most news agencies had barely mentioned it in passing. As I began researching and putting pieces together, I was concerned about the lack of investigative journalism, not just about Trump supporters or insurrection, but about how the Capitol fell so quickly and easily to a crowd of largely unarmed rioters. Full disclosure, since reporting on the January 6th riot, I've been censored by YouTube, had my largest social media accounts removed, and I've been debanked as a longtime customer of Truist. Shortly after the riot, I offered to give my footage to the FBI because I witnessed vandalism and multiple assaults against police officers. But they decided to arrest me and charge me with 4 misdemeanor charges. I mention this because I believe in transparency. I truly believe that you, the everyday American citizen, should be allowed to watch, think, and draw your own conclusions. With that, let's get into my research. The Capitol is protected by a dedicated police force, the United States Capitol Police. As of September of 2020, the Capitol Police had nearly 1,900 sworn officers, making it one of the top 25 largest police departments in the country. And their 2021 budget of $516 million was larger than the police departments of Dallas, San Antonio, and San Jose, 3 of America's 10 largest cities. Throughout the 2020 protests and riots, the law enforcement response in DC was large. At times, the response included not only the Metropolitan Police of Washington, D.C., but federal agents from the FBI, Secret Service, Bureau of Prisons, and even active duty troops. However, on January 6th, it was an entirely different story. The relatively few police officers tasked with guarding the immense West Capitol grounds were unable to prevent large numbers of Trump supporters, protesters, rioters, and even some journalists from entering the building. This has been widely reported on, but what hasn't been as widely reported on is precisely how the Capitol's security and defense failed. How quickly the west side of the Capitol was overrun, with the outnumbered and under-equipped police retreating at least twice in just the first few minutes. How the police failed to focus their defenses on protecting the entrances into the Capitol. How the police retreated and left multiple entrances to the Capitol completely unguarded. This isn't meant as an attack on the individual police officers, many of whom did their best in difficult situations. Rather, this investigation will focus more on the planning, tactics, and strategy of the police. In my opinion, the riot began at 12:53, when two men first pushed the barricades out of the way and approached the police line. This happened at the Peace Circle, at the end of Pennsylvania Avenue, over a mile away from where Trump was still speaking at the Ellipse. This is the path that leads to the first breach of the Capitol building. From the Peace Circle, up to the Capitol, up the staircase, and then through the Senate wing door. At first, there's a relatively small presence. A crowd in the hundreds and a dozen or so police in the area. The crowd was mostly congregating by the Peace Circle, where the path was blocked by two rows of bicycle rack barricades. One here, between the sidewalk and the road, and another in a U-shape behind it. We can see that there are no police at that first line of barricades, but there are uniformed Capitol police officers behind the second line. To the south of the Peace Circle, there are protesters along the west side of the Capitol grounds. This west side is over 400 feet long, with a short retaining wall and a flimsy green plastic mesh fencing. There are signs marking the area is closed, but no police manning the fencing. So to recap, the small Peace Circle path entrance has two rows of barricades with just a few police. Directly beside the Peace Circle is a 400-foot long open area that only has that flimsy plastic fence, no police officers. As you'll soon see, this puts the understaffed and under-equipped police officers guarding the path at a major disadvantage. Back at the Peace Circle, the first barricade line is quickly pushed aside as two men lead the way to the police officers at the second line. While some approach with their hands in the air, others seem to have bad intentions. One of the men even begins posturing as if to prepare to fight, taking off his coat, turning around his cap, and bowing up while getting very close to an officer. The police officer seemed to genuinely try to de-escalate and not provoke anyone. A few protesters start pushing back the barricade, and it doesn't take long for violence to break out. The outnumbered police are unable to restrain their assailants as multiple men push back the second barrier. A female police officer is knocked to the ground and suffers a concussion. Some from the crowd help her up, even as others just feet away fight with police. And now provocateurs are waving more people into the area. At the same time, to the south of the Peace Circle, provocateurs are crossing the mesh fencing and waving people forward. Patriots! Patriots, go! With no police to stop them, people can easily outflank the police by walking beside or behind them. Some of the officers put up a valiant fight, but they are outnumbered and overwhelmed. And some in the crowd are now getting behind the police line, putting the police officers at risk of being surrounded and attacked from all sides. The police must quickly retreat from the Peace Circle. These two incidents, breaking down the barrier while assaulting police at the Peace Circle and removing the green mesh fencing, these two incidents are the first entry into the quote restricted area. The crowd follows as the police retreat down the pathway towards the Capitol. Along the path, rioters remove more unmanned barricades, and it's not until the end of the path that the rioters meet any resistance from the police. Here, where the path meets the West Plaza, is where some of the retreating officers regroup with other Capitol police. Almost immediately, some rioters begin removing the barricades. But the police here are still unprepared. No riot gear, no real defensive line, and again, outnumbered. The mob continues to approach the police officers between them and the Capitol steps. This scene is chaotic. Let's pause this short clip to get a bird's eye view. On the top right of the screen is the Peace Circle, where rioters first broke through. And at the top center of the screen is the west side of the Capitol grounds, where others tore down that plastic mesh fencing. People are entering Capitol grounds all along the west side, but the main movement of people is from the Peace Circle down the northwest pathway on the right of the screen. This is just minutes after the Peace Circle was overrun. It's important to note that at this time, there is little to protect the 3 staircases leading to entrances: the northwest staircase, the staircase in the center of the plaza, and the southwest staircase. Finally, the first police reinforcements and riot gear begin to arrive, and the police are now able to stabilize the situation. By 1 o'clock, they formed a line between the 2 large staircases. In just 5 minutes, the police were outmaneuvered and forced to retreat twice. That's how quickly they lost control of nearly the entire western half of the Capitol grounds to just a few hundred rioters. But now, with reinforcements and riot gear, they will be able to hold their new line between the plaza staircases for the next hour and a half. We should pause here and consider a few different perspectives. These perspectives are critical to understanding why the West Capitol grounds were easily overwhelmed and why things escalated so quickly. The first perspective is that of the police at the Peace Circle. They're few in number, without any riot gear, their barricades torn down and effectively surrounded. These officers are not in command. They don't have the authority to order more officers. They didn't choose the green mesh fence. They don't determine the rules of engagement, those rules they have to follow for any use of force or weapons. The amount of officers in each location, the fencing or barricades used, the rules of engagement, all of those are set by command. After the riot, the Government Accountability Office surveyed over 300 Capitol Police officers in relation to their training and preparedness leading up to January 6th. Nearly a third of the officers responded that they felt only slightly prepared or not at all prepared to use force that day. Although all Capitol Police officers received civil disturbance and crowd control training, half the respondents felt only slightly prepared or not at all prepared to apply crowd control tactics. And over half reported that the guidance they received regarding crowd control in preparation for January 6th was either unclear or they received no guidance at all. In addition, when asked an open-ended question, many officers indicated that the leadership culture of the Capitol Police discouraged any use of force even when it was justified, perhaps due to concern about optics. The Government Accountability Office provided 5 recommendations along with the report, including more realistic and more frequent crowd control training, as well as understanding and clarification of the department's use of force policies. These police officers holding the perimeter were outnumbered and under-equipped. If the officers escalated the incident by using a weapon on the assailants, then it could trigger a reaction from the rioters. That escalation could have put these officers in greater harm. The growing swarm could have easily retaliated against them. Realistically, most people in the same difficult situation would also retreat. The second perspective is that of all the other police, the various other officers, commanders, or even the chief as they watch the situation unfold over the cameras or listen to the radio transmissions. The unmanned west side fencing is torn down. Unknown amounts of people are swarming onto the Capitol grounds, and the small number of police officers at the front line are retreating. And there are potentially tens of thousands more people coming from the Trump rally. If you were in their position, would you feel the Capitol was under threat? Would you declare a riot over the speakers or bullhorns? Would you have reserve police and SWAT already in position? Maybe even the military or National Guard? By comparison, just a few months earlier, this is how the Capitol was secured during BLM protests. Several news media have noted this extreme disparity. So, police leadership is without the same resources and interagency cooperation they had months before. There is no big show of force, a large and visible display of police that could help deter rioters. Police leadership are now in the position where rioters are already at the steps of the Capitol. This creates a more tense and risky situation than if the rioters had been deterred back at the Peace Circle or on the West grounds. Also, the rioters are winning. The successful occupation of a portion of the Capitol grounds is a significant morale boost for the rioters. You can hear the chanting and celebrating. The rioters become more aggressive, more flagrant with each retreat by the police. Effectively, the loss of the West Capitol grounds has upped the ante. It's easy to understand why police leadership would then assume that all protesters heading towards the Capitol must be treated like rioters, as a real and imminent threat. This is an important point as it helps explain some of the later police actions. The last perspective is that of all the other people who did not participate in these incidents, including all the protesters that will arrive later. It's easy for us as viewers, seeing the violence in the footage, to assume that every protester saw or knew about these violent incidents. But let's remember that we only have this vivid and graphic video because of the journalists who rushed to the front where the action was taking place. With a densely packed crowd on level ground, many people can only see the heads of the people in front of them. Also, this was early, and the vast majority of the day's crowd had not arrived. Most protesters were not at the Peace Circle or West Plaza during these assaults on officers. They didn't see what happens, and they were definitely not involved. But what about people who came through the Peace Circle later? Should we assume the worst about them? Should we assume that they were there to assault officers or worse? Remember, the barricades and fences are already torn down or removed when those later protesters arrive. Much of the fence line had no police to begin with, and the few police at the barricades have retreated. Most importantly, the police have not declared this an unlawful assembly over intercoms or bullhorns. Many protesters who arrive later know nothing of the violence at the front line. They know nothing of the barricades pushed back or the officer knocked down or the officers being assaulted. To them, from their perspective, they're just walking up an unrestricted path to the Capitol. To them, it's like any other protest from the past few years. So you have a few different groups with very different perspectives. There's the excited rioters with high morale after they easily overran the police and the entire west side of the Capitol grounds. Then there's the police and leadership, with outnumbered and under-equipped officers in a potentially dangerous and tense situation. They're watching as thousands more descend on their position. And last, there's all the other people who are arriving at the West Plaza and know nothing of the rioting or violence. The possibility for escalation by rioters or the police is very high. This is a powder keg waiting for a match.
USA! USA!
From 1 o'clock onwards, we see the pressure building as Trump supporters flock from the peaceful rally at the Ellipse and arrive at the west side of the Capitol. At first, the crowd is relatively small, a few thousand at most on Capitol grounds. But Pennsylvania Avenue and the Peace Circle are already full of Trump supporters on the way. We can hear plenty of chanting and shouting, but what we cannot hear is any attempt by the police to declare a riot, or warn the people arriving that they could face 6 months in prison just for being present in this area. Still, every minute that passes, there are more pumped up Trump supporters marching down Pennsylvania Avenue towards the west side of the Capitol. They are unaware of what happened to police on the front lines. Back at the West Plaza, there isn't the same concerted effort to breach the police line that we saw at the perimeter, but there is violence. One man, Joshua Black, is injured with a hole in his cheek, and we can see blood on the ground.
You can see it went all the way through. It had a hard plastic bottom and it had like a light bulb type thing on the other side I'm assuming it was full of sand because I was spitting out sand for 2 days. And it's inside my cheek. The crowd had pushed and the cops' line got pushed back, 4 to 8 feet. And there was like a step where I was. And the cop right in front of me fell down and 2 or 3 people, it looked like they were boot stomping him. and I saw an elbow about to come down, so I jumped in there to protect him. And I started yelling, "Don't hurt him. These people signed up to defend our country." I mean, I know they're cops, but I was seeing them more like veterans. We needed to protect them. We didn't need to hurt them. They weren't our enemy.
Some Trump supporters feel betrayed by the police escalation of force and respond in kind, starting a brawl between protesters and the police close to this injured man. Shortly afterwards, police spray this part of the crowd with a chemical irritant.
You fucking shot him! You help him! You're on our side! You're on our side! You fucking take him and help him!
You guys see this guy?
Shortly after this brawl, the Metropolitan Police officers in yellow reflective gear arrive, descending the southwest staircase down to the plaza. With the assistance of these reinforcements, the police are able to push the crowd back on the southern half of the plaza and form a new line with barricades. But on the north end of the plaza, the crowd is already much larger as Trump supporters continue to arrive from the ellipse. Steve Baker is an independent journalist and writer who arrived at the Capitol around this time.
When we first arrived, as I said, there were no more than just a few dozen people actually engaged against the law enforcement, and no more than a few dozen law enforcement. Both of those numbers increased during the next hour to the point where, me not even being aware, I knew that several hundred people were now coming up to that level, but what I was really not aware of was how many tens of thousands of people were down below, around the reflection pool and down the boulevards.
The police escalate their efforts and deploy a new weapon. Even the police on the front line seem to be startled by the exploding flashbangs. Many of these were thrown or fired over anyone who could have been an immediate threat to the police, hitting people deeper in the crowd who are only peacefully protesting.
Fuck you! Yep, they're deploying flashbangs on us.
In addition to the bright light and loud noise from the explosions, eyewitnesses report that some of these devices also contained chemical irritants or pellets.
Look at that! Fucking knocked the lens right out of my glasses.
I was up here peacefully praying for a police officer when I was shot in the face with a flashbang grenade. I can't hear out of my left ear. I have second-degree burns on my face. My hair caught on fire. I can barely see out of this eye.
These flashbangs were capable of causing serious injuries. In this clip, you can watch as one flashbang actually catches a man on fire.
Hey, they just caught him on fire!
You're not supposed to lob a concussion grenade into a crowd. It's supposed to be next to the crowd because then it deters the crowd from advancing. You deploy the munitions wherever they are moving towards. You don't deploy the munitions at the crowd that isn't being violent. And that's really what stoked everything that day, is that initial concussion grenade. I have a minute-long video, and in under a minute, there's 4 concussion grenades that blow up directly at my feet. It pissed people off. And, it pissed me off is because I'm sitting there and I get hit by a concussion grenade, I get sprayed in the face, and I have a big press badge. It makes so much sense now why I'm deaf. It's because I had these blowing up right next to my head.
Flashbangs are an explosive device which can reach over 1,000 degrees, causing serious burns or fires. The exposure to intense sound can also cause irreversible hearing loss. The dangers are multiplied when flashbangs are used in crowded or confined spaces, where the risk of the explosion happening close to an individual is high. As Trump supporters continue to the Capitol in large numbers, they are met with this bombardment. Presumably, the desired effect of these weapons would be to disperse the crowd with as few injuries as possible. But the police tactics here have the opposite result. The flashbangs are injuring people in the crowd, and instead of having an appreciable effect in dispersing the crowd, they appear to have had more of an effect in enraging, perhaps even radicalizing the type of Trump supporter who had spent the last year vocally backing the blue. And remember, As far as I can tell, the police still haven't used a speaker system or bullhorns to declare a riot or command that protesters disperse. From the perspective of peaceful protesters arriving from the Trump rally, it's the police attacking them and not the other way around. Again, most of these protesters still don't know anything about the assault on police at the Peace Circle, as only a small fraction of the crowd had been present for that initial assault at the perimeter. One such Trump supporter arriving during this time period was Angela Regas, a Trump-endorsed candidate from Michigan.
Well, first of all, the walk down from the White House area to the Capitol, the crowd was electric with patriotism, flags, chanting USA. It was really inspiring, actually. And then when we arrived at the Capitol, it was quite a different story. As far as the police presence, we witnessed them tear gassing people kind of unprovoked, tear gassing the crowd. Flashbangs were going off, and I remember just witnessing it, almost the police were assaulting the crowd, if you will. I did notice from my vantage point, there were some people in the front of the crowd that were then spraying some aerosol tear gas back at the police.
What was taking place was just a lot of antagonism. There were people, trying to push through the barricades. There were people just assaulting police officers. There were people that were shooting bear spray. There was a lot of energy coming back from the police side as well, in the form of big industrial side pepper spray guns. So they were hitting the crowd with that. They were launching tear gas and flashbangs into the crowd. I actually got hit by one that bounced off the concrete.
It's now about 1:48. In addition to what we've covered, 2 Trump supporters have suffered fatal heart attacks during this period. Both Kevin Greeson and Benjamin Phillips received CPR from the crowd and eventually were carried out on improvised stretchers. The police have thrown flashbangs into the growing crowd of protesters for the past 30 minutes, injuring several people. And the police concentrated many of the flashbangs in the north side of the crowd, a focal point for protesters arriving from the Trump rally. Remember, that's the path from the Peace Circle to the West Plaza that now has no signs or barricades or officers to tell people not to protest there. And again, police have not announced that protesters must leave. Increasingly, the protesters are feeling that the police are attacking them. Some in the crowd have fought against what they see as aggression from the police, injuring some police officers in the clashes. You can start to see how each group would have a very different perspective. The police likely feel overwhelmed by the large crowd, while the protesters likely feel that they've been assaulted by the police for simply arriving at a protest. This illustrates why it's common practice for police to declare a riot, usually using speakers or bullhorns to command the crowd to disperse, as seen at numerous protests and riots throughout 2020. Declaring a riot gives peaceful protesters the opportunity to leave an area before the police escalate. This reduces the risk that police would injure innocent civilians, but also reduces the risk of antagonizing a peaceful crowd to the point that they retaliate. So this standard procedure both protects innocent bystanders and helps de-escalate an already tense situation. Unfortunately, the police that day deviated from this norm. While they have successfully held this line since 1 o'clock, that's about to change. It's 1:48 p.m. The police line is broken up into 3 sections. The first section stretches from the southwest staircase and across the West Plaza. This is where most of the police gather. The second section is on the bottom of the northwest staircase, which you can see is covered with scaffolding. And the third section is just north of that staircase in the grass. While much of the first and third sections are composed of police in riot gear, the officers on that second section guarding the staircase are unarmored officers. The high walls on either side of the staircase prevent reinforcements from quickly moving between these sections. As we'll soon see, this staircase will become a critical weak point, where the tide begins to turn against the police. It's the staircase that rioters will use to reach the windows at the Senate wing door and then breach the Capitol. The failure to adequately defend this staircase is likely the police's biggest tactical blunder. The action at the bottom of this staircase starts with a conversation between a Capitol police officer in a blue helmet and an unidentified man in a gray hoodie. This same officer can be seen in the same location 50 minutes earlier, meaning he's been under the stress and pressure of an intense situation for almost an hour. We don't know what was said, but as the man turns to walk away, the officer appears to forcefully shove him, resulting in a struggle. Others join in, some using items such as a can of spray, a Gatorade bottle, or a flagpole. Without barricades or riot gear, the police resistance is ineffective, and the police line retreats up the stairs. As we've already seen a few times now, whenever the police retreat, the crowd is quick to fill in the space, and it's no different on the northwest staircase. Several officers from the plaza do move towards the staircase, but in general, the more heavily armed Metropolitan Police and Capitol Police below do not reinforce the staircase. As the fight continues up the stairs, some rioters begin tearing the fabric on the scaffolding. People also begin climbing onto the outer side of the staircase. And provocateurs again encourage people forward up into the scaffolding and up the stairs. Meanwhile, the police still on the plaza continue to deploy flashbangs into the crowd below the staircase. Around the same time, another squad of armored Metropolitan Police reinforcements begins moving from the north towards the plaza, but their progress is slowed as they attempt to move through the crowd. These officers will later pass directly by the northwest staircase and merge with the police line on the plaza. By 2 o'clock, the police guarding the staircase have retreated onto the landing halfway up the staircase. One important point to note is that we can see a deputy chief of the Capitol Police, Eric Waldo, there with these officers. Politico notes that Waldo, a deputy chief and the 6th ranking official in the Capitol Police Department, was a January 6th incident commander, meaning he was responsible for directing officers' movements amid the chaos. Waldo was in charge of the Capitol Police's Civil Disturbance Unit, the better trained and equipped officers assigned to riot and crowd control. This included the heavily armed Capitol Police you could see arriving shortly after the riot began. Waldo would be one of the 7 members of the Capitol Police leadership subjected to a no-confidence vote by the Capitol Police Union. However, he did receive significantly more support than other senior leadership. One such supporter in the Capitol Police wrote the following about Waldo in a whistleblower letter to Congress. Quote, "This hero ran into the fight on the West Front, and the first person he engaged was a man assaulting a United States Capitol Police officer. He then rallies troops and leads officers for hours as demonstrators targeted him for his courage and leadership. He was decontaminated so many times, only momentarily stepping off the line to have water poured on his face, and then he launched himself immediately back into the fight with the officers. When the lower West Terrace fell, he could be observed on the upper West Terrace rallying officers and fighting with such tenacity to still hold the building." That's what one of the Capitol Police officers had to say. However, at this tactically significant time and place, we don't see Waldo bring those heavily armed officers to bear. Instead, as we will see, Waldo will send officers away from the staircase.
Officers, this way!
So this was not an isolated group of officers with no leadership. They had leadership present and aware of how they were losing ground on this staircase. At this point, the crowd is massive. It stretches from the northwest staircase all the way back to the edge of Capitol grounds and beyond up Pennsylvania Avenue. The police are vastly outnumbered, but they do have the advantage of riot gear and weapons. However, they can only make use of that advantage if they can coordinate and use the natural bottlenecks to contain the crowd. Bottlenecks are an important tactical principle. Think of the Battle of Thermopylae, where King Leonidas utilized a narrow pass to legendarily hold back a massive Persian army with only 300 Spartans. Those huge armies were useless since only a small portion of the Persian army could approach at a time. The same principle applies here. If the police want to prevent the breach of the Capitol, they must hold the staircase. But if this staircase falls, then the crowds can move behind the police, in between the police and the Capitol, and the defense of the Capitol will crumble. This is the point of no return. As a squad of Metropolitan Police slowly makes their way to the West Plaza police line, we can see them pass right by the foot of this key staircase. Instead of reinforcing this weak point in the defenses, they instead will join the main plaza line. This failure to reinforce the staircase will be compounded by the actions of one officer. What this one police officer does in front of this massive crowd will cause outrage among protesters and lead to swift retaliation. I believe this is a key moment when police escalation reaches a tipping point for many of the protesters, some of whom will lose all faith and goodwill towards the police. This is where many protesters lose all restraint and finally break the Capitol defenses. It's just after 2 o'clock when we can see a man fall from the staircase. The man's name is Derek Vargo. Let's look at the same incident from a different angle. And now in slow motion. After reviewing many videos of this incident, I can say with confidence that this was no accident. Derek Vargo was pushed off the staircase by a Capitol police officer in a blue helmet and black balaclava. This is the same Capitol police officer in a blue helmet and black balaclava who is involved in starting the conflict at the bottom of this staircase. Being shoved from this height is like falling out a second or third story window, enough to break bones. Derek Vargo was interviewed by Kara Kashranova of the Gateway Pundit.
I just wanted to wave my Trump flag up there like the guy did with the American flags. That was very inspiring. So I went up the side of the building, and as I'm grabbing on one of the cement blocks to get over, one of the officers shoved a pepper spray device and started spraying my face. At that point, I was like, okay, I want to wave my Trump flag. I don't want to die. So I got up and I started walking to the right. That was it. I'm not going to do it anymore. I'm not going to wave the flag. And as I'm going, officer takes both hands, shoves me right off the building.
And I remember looking up at the wall and hearing someone, hundreds of people, honestly, at one time. It seemed like one big gasp, like they were all amazed at what they just saw. So I walked over, and I had seen something fall off the wall, but at the time I didn't know what it was or who it was, we should say. And that's when I walked over to the scene and I realized that they had just pushed someone off the wall. And the general environment, once you got into that direct vicinity of where they actually pushed Derek, it was very aggressive. Protesters were mad, understandably. Even cops, kind of seemed to be like, yo, what's going on here? They really didn't understand the situation. I have multiple eyewitness interviews, and you've probably seen a few of those. Me confirming, hey, did they just push that man off the wall? Did they punch him? And yeah.
There was a guy climbing up the stairs, trying to exit back down. A cop in blue and black pushed him both hands on the back. Right there with it.
You can visibly see that people were very worked up after that happened. And you had, Trump supporters and EMT, and you had police officers actually they used a bike rack, but they rolled them over onto the bike rack and picked them up. And that's when, I get my video and it's super up close. And you can actually see, Derek, he looks like he's turned purple after that fall, but he was completely unconscious in the footage.
After I had fallen, I don't really remember anything except for waking up in the ambulance. I've had a lot of metal equipment put in my body to support my body. I've had to have surgery to have that metal equipment removed. And I still have metal equipment in my body right now that needs to be removed eventually when it's ready.
I saw that they had put him on like one of the barricades as a makeshift stretcher, and they carried him off at that point. I remember people screaming, "Oh, did you get that on camera? Make sure you get that on camera."
I would say that the energy in the area, you could tell that it was about to accelerate, to say the least, or about to get to the next level. The minute that they pushed Derek Vargo, that really seemed like the tipping point. I'd say probably 3 minutes later, that's when that crowd actually gets the rush up that left staircase on the west side. And that's when the Capitol is breached, when that initial crowd pushes up.
In these tense situations, it's imperative that both police and protesters do not escalate, but rather de-escalate wherever possible. Any unprovoked attack by one group could incite the other group to retaliate, leading to more harm and worse injuries. Although both groups bear this responsibility, it's the police that are supposed to be held to a much higher standard. With the powers they're given, they have the potential to do great harm. The police officer that pushed Derek Vargo was at the base of the stairs for about 50 minutes. For most people, being in a prolonged, intense, and potentially dangerous situation could wear down their restraint, leading to outbursts of aggression or violence. Police are no different, except that they have the greater responsibility to use restraint. That's why they have rules of engagement, guidelines around the use of intermediary force, and various types of de-escalation training. And we have seen many police officers show considerable constraint, even when suffering unprovoked attacks. But it seems this police officer could not restrain himself and lost control. First by shoving a protester at the bottom of the stairs, and then by shoving Derek Vargo off the staircase. The crowd of protesters around the northwest staircase has experienced aggression from the police for at least 45 minutes. Flashbangs and other weapons have injured multiple people. And now, in plain view, a police officer shoves a man off a staircase. Many protesters believe the man is dead, or at least critically injured. Remember, the police on the northwest staircase don't have riot gear, they are vastly outnumbered, and they seem to have no reinforcements. Their position holding the bottleneck is all that stands in the way of the Capitol being breached. And because of the actions of this one police officer, they're about to face a renewed fury from many in the crowd. This is it. This is how you break the public trust, the moral high ground, the hope of de-escalation and a peaceful outcome. This is the beginning of the end of the Capitol defense. It's 2:04 p.m. The police continue to bombard the area at the foot of the northwest staircase with flashbangs as that armored squad of Metropolitan Police officers marches past. Finally, the police do declare a riot and instruct people to disperse. It's hard to prove a negative, but this is the first instance I can find of the police making such a declaration. You can hear the announcement in this video captured close to the amplification device.
All people must leave the area immediately. Failure to comply with this order may subject you to arrest and may subject you to the use of a riot control agent or impact weapon.
Shortly after Derek Vargo is carried off through the crowd to the north of the staircase, people begin throwing miscellaneous objects at the police officers on the stairs where Vargo was pushed off of. This seems to be retaliation for what the crowd perceives as an unprovoked serious attack on a non-violent protester.
I remember just thinking and praying that the police didn't start throwing lead into the crowd. I mean, that was my biggest fear at that point, because the energy that I was feeling from the crowd, if the police had started throwing lead and actually just shot people that way, I don't see any way that would have turned out well. I think a lot of people there would have died. So, I mean, I know that a lot of people have kind of started to rip on the Capitol Police, and I think there's some reason for that in very specific circumstances. But I think a lot of restraint was had by many of them, and maybe even just confusion. I mean, the cops looked scared. There was just a lot of energy there and a lot of anger, for sure. I don't think that's something that can just be taken away.
While I can't confirm what orders the Capitol Police here received, I can confirm the timing. The police at the Northwest Staircase have held the line for nearly 70 minutes. In any tactical situation, it makes sense to send the reinforcements you have to where they are most needed, or can make the most impact. But from what we've seen, reinforcements are never sent to the Northwest Staircase. It's likely that just a few of the heavily armored officers could have made a difference. But now, one officer has shoved Vargo off the staircase, incensing the crowd.
Hang traitors! Traitors will hang! Traitors will hang! Traitors will hang!
Under assault from two directions, the police retreat up the staircase.
That's what I always talk about with that day, was that it was just very bizarre. It wasn't like it was always violent either. I mean, obviously there was a confrontation between police and protesters at the moment, and then at some point they stood down, or they had gotten an order to stand down, and then everybody moved up those stairs.
I'm trying to move and find a safer location before I, start videoing again. And when I got to the new location and looked up, in the blink of an eye, there was this free flow of humanity going up the steps. There was no longer any resistance whatsoever. I didn't even see the police line collapse or be breached, or I didn't know what had happened. Because as I said, I was disengaged looking for a safe spot to set up again. And then what ended up happening was, holy cow, they're just moving up with no resistance up that staircase underneath the scaffolding.
The crowd stays close on the police's heels as the people already on the staircase begin to create that flow of people up towards the upper terrace, where they reach the last police line at the top of the stairs. The approximately 15 police officers here have the benefit of a line of bicycle rack fencing, but they no longer have the advantage of the bottleneck which the stairs and temporary structures provided. They are overwhelmed by the superior numbers of rioters in just under a minute, and they soon scatter to the left and to the right, leaving the path to the Senate wing door completely unguarded. With the police out of the way, some rioters seem to make a beeline for the Senate wing door, almost directly across from the staircase. According to the Los Angeles Times, the majority of the Capitol's 658 single-pane windows were quietly upgraded during a 2017 to 2019 renovation of the historic building. The original wooden frames and glass were covered with a second metal frame containing bomb-resistant glass. But planners skipped about a dozen ground floor windows, including some located indoors, because they were deemed to be low risk in the event of implosion, largely due to their discreet or shielded location, or because the building couldn't structurally handle the load of the heavier frames. The windows on either side of the Senate wing door are among the windows which were left unreinforced. It's not clear whether any of the rioters were aware of this vulnerability, but as the crowd spreads out on the terrace, some of the rioters turn and head for the Senate wing door at a run, passing directly by a more visible door to the left and drawing attention in this direction. The first to reach the windows begin to bang rhythmically with their fists, but others start smashing through the windows with objects, including a piece of lumber. At least one police officer arrives just as the first man begins to climb through. But after that officer sprays one rioter, he retreats back down the hallway, leaving the rioters to continue entering unimpeded. One of the rioters is able to kick open the door from the inside. And just like that, the floodgates are open. Consider how quickly the rioters were able to move to the glass window, break it, and enter. The police retreating up the northwest staircase didn't regroup to protect this entrance. This wasn't a tactical retreat. It was a complete breakdown of the Capitol's defenses. The police didn't seem to have any plan when they abandoned the top of the staircase. The Capitol Police had security cameras they could use to stay aware of what was happening on nearly every inch of the grounds. Why weren't reinforcements sent to protect the points of vulnerability? It's as if the police leadership was unaware of the larger picture. But given the poor tactics and preparation we've seen throughout the day, it shouldn't surprise us that few police respond to this broken window. In just the first 60 seconds after the Senate wing door is opened, over 100 people entered the room. But the breach doesn't stop there. At least 3 other entrances appear to have been opened from the inside by individuals who entered through the Senate wing door. And this entrance won't be permanently secured by the police for over an hour. Let's cover this in detail so we understand its importance. In addition to the sheer number of people who entered during this period, some of the most viral, controversial, and interesting characters inside the Capitol come through this entrance. Doug Jensen, one of the first to enter through the broken window, heads north towards the Senate chamber. Images of him wearing a distinctive Q shirt while aggressively chasing a retreating police officer are widely promulgated. Jensen was sentenced to 5 years after being found guilty of 5 felonies, including obstruction of an officer and carrying a dangerous or deadly weapon on Capitol grounds. Jensen is followed by Kevin Seafried, whose rebel flag has made him a poster boy for theories that January 6th was a white supremacist attack. Seafried was sentenced to 3 years after being convicted of 5 charges, including obstruction of an official proceeding. Jacob Angeli, with his unique attire and face paint, became another one of the faces of the riot in the media. Although he's often portrayed as a rioter or an insurrectionist, Angeli made it to the Senate chamber, where he encouraged non-violence and led a prayer.
This has to be peaceful. We have the right to peacefully assemble. In Christ's holy name we pray.
Angeli was sentenced to 41 months after pleading guilty to obstruction of an official proceeding. John Sullivan, aka Jaden X, is one of a handful of left-wing activists and journalists known to be present at the Capitol. Sullivan was captured on his own video instigating at the Capitol as he recorded many events, including the killing of Ashley Babbitt. Sullivan's inflammatory comments,
If we don't get it, we're gonna burn this shit down.
Have led some to theorize that he was part of a false flag operation or a plant. Sullivan is awaiting trial over multiple felonies, including obstruction of an official proceeding, carrying a knife on Capitol grounds, and lying to the FBI about carrying a knife. Sullivan has also had assets seized after selling his footage for 5 figures to multiple news agencies. Zachary Allum will make it all the way to the opposite side of the Capitol, where he is seen smashing a window in the speaker's lobby just feet away from where Ashley Babbitt is shot. Allum is in jail awaiting trial on multiple felonies, including assault and destruction of property. One of the only people killed that day, Ashley Babbitt, entered here. Babbitt was an Air Force veteran who would be fatally shot 20 minutes later by Capitol Police Lieutenant Michael Byrd as she climbed through a broken-out window into the speaker's lobby. Babbitt's killing has been heatedly debated. In addition to the mainstream narrative importance of the people who entered here, this breach was even more important tactically. Now let's show how the breach at the Senate wing door, paired with poor tactics, led to at least 3 other entrances being opened from the inside. It's just minutes later when the first door is opened from the inside by at least one person who came in through one of these windows. This door is right around the corner, a door that the rioters bypassed to attack the Senate wing door. The police are able to temporarily resecure the hallway and the door relatively quickly. However, an entrance on the opposite side of the Capitol will be more significant and stay open for much longer after it is unlocked from the inside. George Tenney entered the Capitol at 2:19 via the Senate wing door. 5 minutes later, Tenney is at the central entrance on the eastern side of the Capitol, the location of the historic Columbus doors. At this point, while panes of glass in the inner doors have been broken by rioters outside, the magnetic locks have kept the inner doors closed. Tenney pushes repeatedly on the door from the inside. It's not clear from the video whether the doors were unlocked by another party or whether Tenney managed to trigger the emergency unlock mechanism described on the red sign. But he is able to get one of the doors opened. While police both inside and outside will attempt to keep this door closed, it will be used by many people both entering and exiting the building. A third door, the West Terrace door, is located in the center of the upper terrace, not too far from the Senate wing door. As a group passes by, the police open the interior doors to allow them to exit. Although they are coming from the opposite direction, at least some of these individuals actually entered through the Senate wing door. Only a few take the opportunity to exit the building. But as soon as the outer doors are opened from the inside, people already gathered outside on the upper terrace begin to enter. The police inside end up standing aside both times they try to block the hallway, and over 300 people enter through this entrance. The doors remain open until police are able to secure them from the outside as they clear the upper terrace. Hindsight being 2020, we can see that these people were only able to enter because the Senate wing door was breached earlier in the hour. But from the perspective of hundreds of Trump supporters, they were allowed to enter with the explicit or implicit permission of the police.
You can disagree with it, but respect me try.
There was no physical force used to open these doors or make the officers stand aside, but many of these protesters are still labeled insurrectionists or rioters. Back at the Senate wing door, the police have gained control of the entrance and are ushering people out through one of the windows. But after losing a pushing match over the door, they retreat away from the door. People continue to make their way in and out of the door and windows as Capitol Police stand by, even accepting fist bumps and handshakes as they watch. Defending a place as large as the Capitol after an entrance is breached is quite difficult, especially when other entrances are unsecure or able to be opened from the inside. Watching as people move through the Capitol, opening other doors, we're left wondering, why wasn't the response better coordinated? And why was it so weak and delayed? Why weren't all other entrances reinforced or further secured? Most importantly, why, after seeing the thousands of protesters on the West Capitol grounds, after seeing the rioters push up the northwest staircase, after seeing the police line crumble, why wasn't this entrance defended? From the beginning of January 6th, the police had the advantage in terms of terrain, equipment, communications, and live video monitoring of the entire building. They are also one of the best funded and largest police departments in the entire country. DC also has a history of strong policing cooperation with numerous federal departments. Let's recap some of the details of the day, the back and forth of the crowd, and the on-the-ground tactics. Why was the perimeter so weakly defended? They did have some barricades, but the officers' flanks were completely open to anyone who would hop over or remove those flimsy green fences. Perhaps they didn't expect Trump supporters to have the same likelihood of rioting as they did BLM, Antifa, or other groups. Why did the police use flashbangs and crowd control munitions before declaring a riot? Declaring a riot would at least give the peaceful protesters the opportunity to slowly make their way out of the crowded plaza. It would also prevent unnecessarily antagonizing the protesters or escalating the situation. Why were crowd control munitions used in a way that set someone on fire and blew a hole through someone's face? In a general order issued after January 6th, the Metropolitan Police gives specific guidance for the use of sting ball munitions, which I believe is how they refer to the flashbangs deployed. Quote, "When deploying sting ball munitions, members shall consider wind direction and except under extenuating circumstances, members shall deploy them underhand by rolling them along the ground rather than throwing them in the air. Members shall provide a warning prior to deployment when practical." Why did the main riot police force stay down on the plaza away from the Capitol entrances for half an hour after they had been outflanked? These officers were not deployed effectively to prevent hostile actors from gaining access to the interior of the building. The police leadership has access to a vast security camera network. They had every ability to observe multiple angles of every second of the riot. But they didn't coordinate riot police to the northwest staircase, even though it was the most pressed by rioters and protesters. And worse, they didn't have a single officer at the Senate wing door as the windows are being busted in. Now, let's consider the most controversial events we witnessed. Moments where individual officers may be called into question for their actions. Why hasn't there been any accountability for the police officer who seriously injured Derek Fargo by pushing him off the staircase? Fargo is not an imminent threat to any officers, and this officer could have let Fargo continue down the stairs. And even if Fargo was a threat, this officer could have pulled Fargo to safety to effect an arrest. But instead, this officer shoved Fargo from a height that would be classified as deadly force. That's the most extreme end of the police use of force continuum. Deadly force is only justified in self-defense when there is serious and imminent danger of death or serious bodily harm. How did the deputy chief end up on the particular staircase which would end up being the avenue to the interior of the Capitol when his officers retreated? Quite literally, one of the top leaders of the Capitol Police was there on the staircase. He could see what was happening. I'm sure the answer to some of these questions are out there. Maybe it's in publicly available information, which I haven't reviewed. Maybe it's in the thousands of hours of unreleased video, audio, and documents which the government has been working hard to keep under wraps as sensitive or highly sensitive. I know that sounds far-fetched, but it's true. Most of the video, audio, and documents from the Capitol Police, Sergeant at Arms, and Speaker of the House have still not been released. It seems that the more research I have done for this story, the more questions I have. But if I am convinced of one thing in my research, it's that the most popular narratives of the Capitol riot do not hold up under scrutiny. On the one hand, there is the narrative that the police stood no chance against the hordes of armed Trump supporters intent on storming the Capitol and causing an insurrection. The truth is, the result we saw was not inevitable. The vast majority of Trump supporters involved were not armed, and the police defense of the Capitol only collapsed because of this series of tactical failures. On the other hand, the idea that the police started the riot by attacking a completely peaceful and law-abiding crowd is not correct. It was not the police that initiated the first violent encounter at the perimeter. And there are other examples of rioters and provocateurs damaging property, chasing police, assaulting police, and other forms of escalation. It's only by a careful examination of the facts that we can understand the nuances and complications of the truth. While the police did use flashbangs on the largely peaceful crowd, from their perspective, they had been under continuous assault for over 30 minutes. While many of the people who initially entered Capitol grounds were well aware they were entering a restricted area, many who came later, after the signs were torn down, did not have that same knowledge. While some saw the pushing and shoving of police officers at the first barricade, for others, their first experience of violence was being hit with flashbangs or witnessing the police officer push Derek Bargo off the staircase. While the initial people to bust in through the Senate wing door certainly had malicious intent, other people entered the Capitol through open, undamaged doors with police officers allowing them to enter. Many people look at the events of January 6th and conclude that it was a setup. A recent report released by House Republicans examined the failures in planning leading up to the day, including evidence that police leadership were taking their cues from Speaker Pelosi's office. Here are some salient points from that report. Quote, leadership and law enforcement failures within the U.S. Capitol left the complex vulnerable on January 6, 2021. House rules dictate that the Sergeant-at-Arms is to report directly to the Speaker of the House. The Speaker's office was heavily involved in planning and decision-making before and during the events of January 6, 2021, and micromanaged the Sergeant-at-Arms. The report goes further, saying that the Sergeant-at-Arms, quote, succumbed to political pressures from the office of Speaker Pelosi and House Democrat leadership, and was, quote, compromised by politics and did not adequately prepare for violence at the Capitol. However, I tend to follow a principle called Hanlon's razor, which says to never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity. I believe the most likely explanation for police behavior and mistakes is incompetence, not outright malice. I'll leave it up to you to make up your own mind. Whether you believe this was an insurrection, a peaceful protest, or somewhere in the middle, you need accurate and relevant facts to base your opinions on. And I hope I provided some of that to you through this project. I truly believe that you, the everyday American citizen, should be able to watch, think, and draw your own conclusions.